Oh, I see the
Right,
red light. Now I'm all
there
scared.
we are. Right, thanks guys, thanks for turning up. Hopefully we'll have a few more people join us by the time we've finished our conversation. We had people like Jess turn up right at the final minute last week, where
I've gotten
the
it wrong by an hour before.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's easy done. Scott Vogel today was asking what the time difference was again, and it's both him and I that keep posting these things with both time zones. So I thought if anyone would be able to remember, it'd be him, but apparently not. Right. So tonight's conversation is about general workflow in digital consoles, what people are doing in terms of the two main camps of gain structure,
Mm.
or two and a half camps if you count Robert Scoville's approach of going through subgroups as well. And I'd like to cover whether or not people are using macros and to what extent, and anything else that we can think of along the way. So I think what we'll do is, Kim, we didn't get to hear much from you last week. We had some very impassioned speakers who had a lot to contribute. And it was a great conversation last week, but I think there was a few times where it was difficult for a few people to get in what they wanted to say. So we'll start off with you this week.
Sure.
What's your approach? Let's start at the very beginning of
Mhm.
the process, and what's your approach to gain structure?
Oh man, I didn't even realize that there like were multiple options to this
Okay.
until we kind of started talking. I mean, I'd heard about people doing the mixing at zero, but I kind of had thought about that as like people that maybe didn't have as much of an audio background, you know? Because
Yeah.
I feel like the way I was taught, because I went to school for audio, more for like studio and recording stuff, but one of the first things that they talked about was kind of gain staging. And the phrase that they kind of hammered home was like in a Pro Tools session, for example, you would want to like kiss the yellow, you know? You would want to not be close to clipping, but like still have quite a lot of gain going in there. And I, moving into live audio, just kind of applying that same thing, always trying to get kind of in the middle,
Yeah.
And that seems to have served me pretty well, although I've been really interested hearing people like Drew Brashler talking about it when he's talking about specifically in monitors, how it can speed up your process if you kind of standardize things with your faders at zero. I'm still a little skeptical.
Yeah, I was a little bit. I think I was a little bit confused about Drew's workflow, and then Elliot actually brought it up in Goes to 11, and there was a bit of a discussion on there. But it is a different approach to the way I do things. I mean, the mixing at zero thing wasn't the first thing that I learned either.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a theatre background. I didn't go to school for audio. I left university after not enjoying the course that I was doing at all, and just decided that I'd find a job before moving on to whatever the next thing was. And I ended up in the bar of a local theatre.
Mm-hmm.
I got dragged backstage to help push cases, and decided that it was a lot more interesting. Now, it was while working in theatre that the mixing at zero thing wasn't necessarily taught to me, but
Mm-hmm.
that was at the point where I learned that. Now, at that point, it seemed really useful for if you're throwing faders, you've got a cast of 14 on stage or whatever. If you know that every time someone walks on stage, their fader's going to zero, then it
Mm-hmm.
seemed really sensible. But I don't do a lot of that kind of work anymore, so it
Mm-hmm.
sort of, it's fell by the wayside. But because I've seen the uses and the advantages of both sides, it's something that always interests me. What's
Mm-hmm.
your approach to this, Steve?
I come from more of a recording background, and I've always been taught and for years now very cognizant of what the level is to take best advantage of of the bits in recording. And so I want it hot enough where the signal is being described as well as possible, but not having any problem with the transients and not risking going over, because if someone's knocking out a great performance and they hit a hard note, I don't want it to not be there because I wasn't ready for it. So that's where I live, and I don't mix at zero. And talking about theater, it makes complete sense visually why that would be a good idea. I'm mixing music, so I get high resolution fader stuff. Like, I don't want my faders at like half a centimeter off the bottom, but at the same time, I try and do it a little bit like Scoville. So I've got my faders up around unity so my mix is sort of floating around unity, and then they go into a group, and the group will say bring the drums up or down. I actually keep my groups at unity also and use a VCA to control the group.
Okay. See, I work a similar way to yourself then. My control groups or VCAs and groups, I look at them from the opposite point of view. So I'll start my session with my input faders at 0. I'll gain the preamp up to a level where I'm like yourself, I'm getting enough signal into the channel, but with headroom for any transients. And then I'll through a subgroup bring that up to a level where I would, a starting point where I think having the input fader at 0 would work. So for instance, kick and snare, I have a kick and snare group, toms group, and a metals group. I will mix the kick and snare into the kick and snare group with their own faders at 0, but then balance the two within the group. As I go through my groups, once I'm happy with a group, so I've worked on its input channels, and then I've done any group processing, I'll pull that group all the way out, move on to the next group, and then I'll kind of build a mix with those groups, with my control groups sat at unity, so that when I come to show time, my approach is that with any luck, all of my control groups and all of my input faders are somewhere near a mix at 0. Then that way, if anything goes terribly wrong, I kind of know where I'm supposed to be going back to. But this is something that I've only been doing fairly recently. It's a process that I've been building since seeing Robert Scoville's video on gain structure, and it's part of a show file that I've been building almost constantly since the start of lockdown. So what you run through groups? What's your grouping structure looking like? Are you how far down do you break your groups?
Well, I'm working on an SC48 at the moment, so I only have 8 channels for groups. So okay. I'm just running 4 stereo pairs. Yeah. So I would run more, but I don't have that option. So mine ends up being fairly simple just because that's the extent of the resources that I have. So I have a drum bus, which is all drums, and then I have a shells only, which is parallel compression bus. Mm-hmm. And then I have an all instruments bus, and then I have a live vocals bus, and I also have playback vocals, and they're not in a bus. And the reason why is because they stay fairly consistent. I just like to be able to have my finger on, there's 2 live vocals, and I like to be able to, I have to reach for them often. And I don't necessarily want the playback vocals to go up and down. They're consistent. It's how the singer's dealing with life that day that kind of dictates where that fader is at any given moment in the show. Yeah. So it's not very complex. I would like to have more resources, but that's what I have. I mean, in my I'm a studio mixer, so in that setting, it's way different. I'm running buses everywhere.
Yeah.
But it's just easy. I have to really think about my resources on a console much more carefully.
So what's your approach to this then, Kim?
I mean, I haven't really worked on a lot of like Steve was talking, consoles with a lot of resources for busing. Like the last tour that I did was on an M32, not necessarily by my choice. It was more of a budget, and then they really wanted to do the system where you can do your monitor mix on your phone. So I was kind of locked into the M32 for that. And as a result, I mean, you can do VCAs, and I did have a few VCAs, but I mean, as far as like parallel processing or whatever, it's just so clunky on something like that that I'm not sure it's really that useful for me. I've tried doing some drum compression using auxes and whatnot, but as far as like grouping and stuff, on that tour, honestly, most of the VCAs that I was actively using, aside from, you know, having like a star vocal one just to always have it on the top, was more, that particular show had a lot of instrument changes. So there was like the rock band section, and then there was like the bluegrass section, and then the solo acoustic section, and, you know, all these different parts of the show. And then I found myself using the VCAs to fade out or make smooth transitions as they were changing instruments on stage, which I'd never really done before. So that was a cool use of VCAs and groups for me. When I use like an SC48 or something like that at a different job that I do, we can get into a little bit more, you know, grouping and stuff. But honestly, I kind of like to have my hands all over the place.
Yeah.
Groups, I always kind of get a little lost in remembering like, what are the individual levels going into this group right now, you know? It'd be useful to have something that had like a really easy spill to be able to see it, you know?
Yeah.
A Pro 2 or something like that.
That's interesting, because that takes me on to one of the other things that I wanted to talk about, which was macros. I'm not sure how much you guys are doing with macros, but one of the things that you can do on the Digico, on the SD9, you have 8 programmable buttons. On some of the bigger desks, you've got a lot more options, and I think you can do them in layers as well. You can also assign macros to the mute buttons and fader up and down moves. Now, the fader up and down moves are from the bottom of its travel, you know, leaving the bottom and reaching the bottom, which I've found some use for. But one thing that I did want, which you can't do, and I'm not sure why, was to be able to assign a macro to a solo button, which would, because on the Digico you've got spill sets, so you can say your all of your drum inputs and any reverbs that you might have for your kit. You can assign them to a spill set, and then you can have a macro that brings your spill set to the surface. Now, if you could assign that macro to the solo button of a subgroup, that would do what you've just described. But apparently that's not a feature at the moment, and I tried asking but didn't get a response.
So run that by me again. What is it that you would? So you'd hit the solo button, and then what would you accomplish?
So it would basically bring to the surface only the members of that group. So that's similar to hitting the solo button and having it go into a send on faders mode, but it would limit what it's showing to, you know, maybe 8 channels of a percussion section if it was a percussion bus. No matter where within layers or banks those channels were, it would just bring all of them to the surface. Now these spill sets come in handy for if you've got you could have a vocalist spill set where you've got the vocalist input channel on one layer on, you know, one bank, but you've got their reverb sends and returns somewhere else. Now you can put all of them into one set you can spill that set and have it all of those channels just appear consecutively on one side of the desk. I have started using these recently for a vocal reverb and a guitar reverb, and they are coming in really handy. But they, like I say, it's just not available to put onto a solo button. And I'm not sure why you can assign it to a mute button but not solo button, because I have some macros within my show file that include the mute functions, but I can think of sort of more uses for putting it on a solo button. You know, something that's a macro you could fire without it being destructive mid-show. You know, you don't necessarily want to mute a group in the middle of a show just to fire a macro, which would, you know, it would give you a set of 20 on the SD9, 24 extra macro keys. So maybe, you know, maybe that's something that they'll add to the software in the future, but it's just not something that's available at the moment. Were you using any macros at all on the M32? Because on the right hand side of the desk, it's got the user definable keys.
Yeah, but I mean, just for, you know, tap delay, they have knobs on the full-size M32, so I'm using those for reverb times. I had a record start-stop macro built in because I was multi-tracking. Or not multi-tracking. I was multi-tracking, but the start-stop was for the USB board mix.
Okay.
I was doing both. Which I wish I didn't have to do, but we ran out of channels in the multi-track. We went all the way up to 32, so there's no way to do a board mix into the laptop. But yeah, what else was I doing? I think, yeah, just tap delay, effects parameters. I think I was just using the scene buttons for moving between scenes and cues. I wasn't doing anything fancy there. Yeah.
Yeah. How did you find the USB recorder on that console?
Well, I've heard people, I've used it a ton. So I do a lot of wedding and corporate event band stuff, and we record everything that we do with those bands. And I mean, we record 3-4 hours at a stretch every weekend, and I've never had it crash. I have heard people say that it's caused their board to crash. But I think that was mainly linked to using a corrupted USB stick or, you know, something that wasn't formatted right. But I've personally found it to be really seamless and really easy.
Okay, because I used it a few times and I had no problem up until the point where I did, and then and then never used it again. I'd recorded a good long section of one of the shows, and everything seemed to be running fine until I hit the stop record button, and then the whole console crashed.
Oh no!
And I just, you know, it may well have been, like you say, just a USB stick issue or something else causing the problem, but it just seemed like one of those things where, you know, I didn't want to risk it in the future.
I guess I've never stopped it mid-show.
And I bet now you never will.
No.
No.
Yeah, it's not a good idea. How about yourself, Steve? Are you using any macros or you know, use programmable keys within your setup?
I'm only using a tap delay, and then I'm using snapshots.
Okay.
So it's not heavy lifting really, and I only have a snapshot at this point per song.
Yeah.
I had experimented with the idea of doing more. I have the board here, so I've been working on the show, and I started to do a bunch of stuff, but I'm not in front of a PA, and I said I am going to so screw myself because I'm going to get in front of a PA, and I'm going to start hitting snapshots, and I'm going to like nothing, and I'm going to just be like, oh, I just ruined my life by having a whole 100 snapshots that all don't work. So I said, let me just build starting places and keep it a bit simpler for the time.
So the continuity can get so confusing when you start building snapshots, and especially ones that only affect certain parameters. You can really get yourself into a mess if you don't know what's in there.
Absolutely.
Sure.
See, now this was going to be one of the other things that we touched on tonight, was automation. So as we seem to have reached automation, What are you guys using? What are you scoping in your recalls? Are you just fader moves, or are you going the whole hog and doing any kind of dynamics or EQ or any kind of pans or any routing changes, or are you doing anything dramatic or anything unusual?
I can jump in on that. Before this last tour that I did, I really wasn't doing a lot of automation because it was like one-offs and the wedding band thing where you just don't really need to be doing that, and with one-offs, like, you just don't have time to know what's going to happen next.
Yeah, you don't even know what's coming.
so it's just not worth the hassle to try and add that level of complexity. But for this last tour that I did, it was 19 dates over 4 weeks, so we had the time and we had rehearsals going into it, so I kind of wanted to try it for the first time. And I ended up doing, what did I have? I had gain changes because of these switching instruments that were happening. The lead guy had 3 or 4 different acoustic guitars that were all totally different. So I had those parameters in there. I had effects changes. I had mutes, which was really frightening for a little bit because if it's not a clean, transition, that's pretty obvious.
You've got to time that right.
But it's so useful when people are putting things down that could take off, just to automate that. Effects mutes were in there, so when I would switch the scene, anything that I wasn't using would mute. There was a lot of stuff going on, but it was kind of different for every song too. On the M32, they do a pretty good job of showing the scope of what's saved in each snapshot, so that was pretty straightforward.
Yeah, the M32 for what price point it's at, I think the queuing system is it's got a lot of functions. You've got is it queues, scenes, and snippets, so you can I can't remember the order of it, but I think, let's say that scenes is how you would record into a scene, and you could record 10 songs in whatever order you want, but then you can have queues that load scenes, so you could load the scenes out of order. And then on top of that, you can have snippets loaded, which, have a scope of their own. So you may just load a snippet that affects the EQ of the lead vocal. So yeah, that's one thing that always surprises me about the difference between the higher end desks and desks at the X32, M32 kind of price point. There seems to be a lot of features packed into desks of that kind of size. The DL32, the 32 channel stage box, that's got 16 outputs as standard, whereas the D-Rack from Digicore has got 8, and you have to buy another 16. Things like the USB recorder on the M32 and X32. And then as far as I'm aware, as standard, it comes with the Clark Technique 32 in, 32 out card in the back. And these desks at this kind of price point just seem to come really sort of full of features.
It's a killer value.
Yeah. And I hear people online talk about the sound quality of them, and I've never had any major problems with them. Certainly when you do consider that they're not a £100,000 or $100,000 desk. But I think they're great.
Well, even they're so flexible too. Like I was going to say, we on this tour didn't have a monitor engineer, but they wanted to do their own monitors. And we were just maxing out the channels. So we had a rack mount M32 in addition to the front of house M32, and we're sharing preamps. And so at front of house, I can be adjusting preamps, or they can change in my snapshots or whatever you want to call them. And it'll affect monitors as well. So when he plugs in his acoustic guitar, even though we don't have a monitor engineer and I don't have control over what that board is doing as far as scenes, the gains track, Right. So there's so many levels of convenience and flexibility with that, M32, X32 ecosystem, man.
Yeah. And then you've got, if you wanted to sort of carry on that same theme of, monitor mixing, band members doing their own monitor mixes, there's the Ultranet output on the back of there where you can plug in the PM16s or whatever they're called, the little like personal mixers. And you know that again, at the price point of those are a lot less than the Avions. You know, I've never heard any bad words said about them. And things like MIDI capabilities, you know, you can send and receive MIDI through the M32 and X32s, which I've used in the past.
What do you use that for?
I've used the MIDI signals for firing like QLab cues. You know, nothing major, not really anything interacting with any kind of specific MIDI devices as such. Just I've used them as kind of triggering for external playback.
Gotcha.
But you know, there are people out there that are using MIDI for all sorts of things, and I think it's again at a desk at that price point, it's brilliant to be able.
I'd like to be using it to switch snapshots at the beginning of each song, but I get time code, but it's an audio, and I have to transform it to MIDI in order to make the board follow it. And I'm kind of going, why do I need to add another layer of hardware to this to make this work?
Yeah.
So,
so what's we've spoke about your sort of automation. What would you said that you're trying to limit your automation with the desk that you've got there because you don't really want to take it in front of a PA and you know, and end up with a lot of scenes or snapshots that are unusable. But in an ideal world, what would you generally be automating? And that's a little bit different for studio and live, so we can maybe touch on the difference in the workflows once we've got through some live automation things, because I know there are similarities and differences between the two, and Kim can speak to this as well, I'm sure. But yeah, if you in an ideal world, what would you be automating in a live situation?
Well, what I'm doing now is only faders and mutes. And I was watching a Pooch and Raybold one, and they both talked about not having any mutes enabled on outputs because they both had accidents. And I thought, well, it's smart to learn from other people's experiences. So I don't have any of those, and they were talking about it at the same time. I hadn't previously been using snapshots because I only got started on this Avid board in October, and then I only have the board like when it gets wheeled in, and we set up and then go, and I don't usually have time. So I haven't messed with a lot previously because I don't want to mess something up as we're working up into a show, because if I screw something up, then that's going to be really stressful.
So you usually an SSL console guy?
No, I'm usually a Pro Tools guy.
Okay.
So I actually have not been on a console in my studio world forever. So, I mean, I was in a studio a little while ago, and everybody was joking that I was mixing on the SSL, but I had my laptop sitting on the SSL.
Yeah.
Because the SSL for me at this point is a big, awesome volume knob.
Yeah.
And
I only recently watched one of your videos when you stopped turning into Hellboy on YouTube. Kim, this was such a bizarre. I'll try and send you the video through Instagram. Such a bizarre, some kind of error within my TV, where I was trying to watch one of Steve's videos on YouTube, and for some reason, every time I clicked on it, it started playing a really glitchy version of Hellboy, which was bizarre because I think I watched about 5 or 10 minutes of Hellboy on Netflix about 3 weeks ago. So I'm not sure where it's grabbing that footage. Like it's grabbing it from somewhere in its memory, but the TV's doing something weird. So I kind of filmed it and sent it to Steve on Goes to 11, and
I was like, "Yeah, I'm Hellboy."
It was so bizarre. But yeah, I watched your home studio.
Oh, cool.
Your there's a lot of nice gear in there. So what is your how much does your workflow differ from if you were to be mixing a live band in front of you now to having a recorded bunch of tracks?
It's quite different. So I've only been mixing live music now for a year and a half. I started mixing one of the acts that I've been working with for a long time.
Okay.
They invited me to go do it, and I just fell in love with it, and it's really fun. But my studio mixing stuff, the sessions they're large sometimes.
Yeah.
So, I've got like close to 40 inputs on the show at the moment. I do a lot of hip hop and urban music, and those will tend to be simpler, but I will do pop mixes that have over 100 tracks.
Right.
Pretty typically.
Yeah.
And I run maybe 8 parallels on drums for different things. So that not all the drums would go in them. So like I have 2 different saturation with compression things. I have a low air. I have distortion. And it's like, say if I need the kick drum to poke a little bit more, I'll start pushing it into one of those. So it's not like all the drums go into all of the things, but it's a way of controlling transients.
Okay.
I run all of my vocals, like a lead vocal will go into a bus, and all the processing will be on the bus as opposed to on the channel. And that way, if I have like another vocal that's going to sound the same, I just run it also into that bus. Then I'll probably have a second one. If the chorus is sung in a different range, I'll have a second bus that's the chorus vocal. It'll essentially be the same, but it gives me the opportunity to EQ it or compress it a bit differently, because sometimes the singer's singing harder. I need like to address it slightly differently, not like massively, but sometimes it can get a bit screechy if somebody's singing harder in the chorus or something. So maybe I'll have, 1 or 2 vocals as they come to me. Most sessions come to me. Everybody works like this now. I get a lot of stuff from Ableton and FL Studio. I just have them send me where they were at.
Okay.
So what happens is I get their levels and I ask for their processed vocal and their dry vocal. Because sometimes their processed vocal, they've done something really cool to it, and trying to reinvent that is fruitless.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's too processed or too not well enough done to sound like a record. So sometimes I end up blending those two together to get the character of the weird thing they did and get the sonics using the original vocal. And so most of my mixes, actually Pro Tools mixes, because I get them like as stems, my faders are at 0 in my Pro Tools mixes. And I just, every time I add compression, like I'm trying to make sure the output is the same level. And I try really hard to maintain their vision of the mix until I get to the point where I'm like, okay, I'm beating their thing, and I know now that the bass needs to be louder than what they had.
Okay.
But I try and get to where they were at and sounds good. And then, because sometimes this happens to me a lot, especially with really creative producers, it feels amazing and sounds like shit.
Right.
So if I make it sound amazing and feel like shit, nobody's happy.
Yeah.
So that's the balance. And I will reference back to their original mix like every 1 or 2 minutes when I'm first building the original shape.
Okay.
And then the drums are often already very good sounding because they're like programmed drums or like built on samples.
Yeah.
I'm often not doing as much as like, except for parallel compression and stuff like that to bring them forward. In my live world, I am like shaping things much more aggressively.
Yeah.
And as you know, I've been working with Chris a little bit, and like the amount of stuff that we're pulling out of sounds is hyper aggressive compared to what I was doing before.
Okay. So it's the live world, you would say, is a lot less forgiving in terms of what can be left in the tracks.
I would say all the moves are much bigger.
Yeah.
In live.
Okay.
When I turn something up, I turn it up more. When I EQ something, I EQ it more. And when I compress something, I compress it more. And
right.
the subtle things are lost, but the art of really making something out of nothing is more. Like my starting place on a kick drum or a snare drum, truthfully, in a live setting is just not near as good as probably where I'm starting in a recorded setting.
Yeah. So you say you're referencing the artist's mix. Do you use any reference tracks while you're working as well, or do you find something similar and listen to that as you go?
Yeah, so I try and find something similar, and I even ask them for references, like what do you want to sound like?
Yeah.
Particularly because it gives me some insight as to what they like and what they feel, and it helps me, it informs me as to sonically, like genre-wise, where they want to be. And if there's like a common thread, which is maybe easier for me to derive than them sometimes, and it helps me with effects, because like the setting of the effects affects like the sensibility of the genre a lot. And so if someone is coming from Toronto, I already know, and I'm not even being stupid, like there's going to be a lot of reverb.
Okay.
Because it's coming from that whole like weekend kind of vibe that's coming out of Toronto. So I already know sort of where that's going in a lot of cases, and that helps a lot. So if they give me references, it just helps with the setting. But I want to get it to the point where I'm equaling their mix vibe-wise, but beating it sonically, and then I try and go to the next place with it, is kind of my workflow. And I find, honestly, if I do too much is when I get myself in trouble.
Okay. What about yourself, Kim? What's your approach?
I think that a lot of times, like, the live is just so much more driven by like the constraints of it, like there's so much more of a time crunch. The source signals are often, like Steve was saying, not as good. When you're working in the studio, you have the ability to edit anything that's not relevant,
or
like
change the sound.
Yeah. Like when I'm doing like a rock drum thing in Pro Tools, I go ahead and I edit out anything that's not a tom hit,
Right.
Like you're just removing all the trash and all of the like not useful stuff. But in a live setting, it's all happening, and it's
right.
It's a different set of priorities almost, like and also like the reference thing is not there in the same way. Like you're referencing what's happening on stage, you're reinforcing that sound, but you're not necessarily working off of, well, we want to make it sound exactly like the record. Sometimes you are, but a lot of times it's more of a, an organic process. Yeah, I mean, the reference thing is so important. A lot of the like recorded stuff I've done, and I know Liam, you've listened to this, but like is like more in the rock metal world. And I don't really listen to a lot of metal just casually, So for me, the reference mixes are so important because like that aesthetic is not my aesthetic. Like I would never think, you know what I should do? I should add 4 more layers of distortion, But that's what we're shooting for. So using the reference mixes is so helpful. And thinking about like what else is majorly different. Compression, use of compression. Like I feel like in live, I just don't have the luxury of doing these multiple stages of finely tuned compression. Time, technical restrictions, like we were talking about, a lot of boards, you just can't do that many levels of, you've got your kick into your kick snare, into your drum, into your instrument, into your main, like all of these things in Pro Tools, I would have a compressor on. So it's just and the subtlety thing. I think I totally resonate with that, Steve, that in the live world, you're kind of having to hammer everything home a little bit more just so it's obvious what's happening, you know, especially over top of the live sound. If you're in a not huge room, you're going to have live drums in there too. So if you want to add some snap to your kick drum, it better be snappy, you know?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of differences.
Yeah, the EQ approach for me was a big shift. I'm not scared to add a lot of EQ, and if I need more, add more. And live, that's, you're gonna just ruin your life, like
yeah,
feedback
totally.
issues and stuff like that. I'm cutting everything live, and you know, if I'm mixing a rock record, I'm going full Chris Lord algae. Like he's like, more top end, still boring, add another EQ, more top end. You know, and you just can't do that in a live setting.
Yeah, you can accomplish it in different ways. So like, you know, instead of shaping this like crunchy, you know, punchy thing, you can just ride that fader up when it happens, you know?
Right.
Especially because you're not going into a limiter as hard often. Like in a recording setting, you have to stay under whatever your final gain stage is. And in a live setting, if there's a solo that you want to just punch through, you know, it's probably okay. The DB police probably aren't going to catch you.
Yeah.
I've lost my train of thought. Going back to what you said about whether or not it's mixed like an album live. You know, people like Pooch, one of his lines is that he wants it to sound like an album with impact. And then I remember watching one of many videos of Big Mick, who's Metallica's engineer, and his approach is totally different. He said he wants to mix Metallica. He doesn't want to mix an album. What would be your go-to philosophy for that? You know, I know it's very much down to the artist, and that's one of the questions at the summit that I asked Dave right at the very beginning. You know, how much of your own spin do you think you should be able to put onto a mix? And you know, his answer was kind of, well, that's a decision that you and the artist have to make together from the outset, which is, you know, that's reasonable. But if given free reign, do you think that you would prefer to sit with an album and then try and mix as close as possible to that album, or do you think you would prefer to just kind of freewheel it and see what comes out?
I think the natural inclination is to just go for it. But when you have the time, like we were talking about before, when you're doing one-offs or you're working, you know, a wedding band or whatever, and you don't like, I'm not going to try and make my wedding band sound like Stevie Wonder when they play Stevie Wonder, you know, like the aesthetic is totally different there. But like, if I'm working with an artist for multiple shows and we have time, or like if there's like a specific album that they're promoting, I don't know if I would take it to the point of like, okay, well, the acoustic guitar on this track is really bright, so I'm going to put it in my snapshot that this song has to be really bright. I don't think I would go there unless it was like a big gig, you know, where, you know, that kind of detail matters. But I think the core aesthetic of it makes sense to try and emulate that. Like if you're working with an artist, especially when we're talking about like how far above the band is that vocal, you know, that's a key part of their sound that their crowd is probably going to recognize and appreciate. Is like, if you're doing a singer-songwriter, they want to hear that vocal on top, you know, or if you're doing a metal band, it's probably going to be more buried, and like trying to capture the general aesthetic. But I don't know if I could dig in on the super fine details unless it's a signature effect, like a vocal effect that Steve was talking about, like a distortion or a crazy delay or something like that. That would be worth the time probably to try and emulate.
How about you, Steve? Do you sort of strive for an album, or?
So I like slick mixes. I like to make my thing sound like a record. That being said, energy is created live differently than it is in the studio. But I want it to sound like the live version of the record. So meaning that in some ways, like the drums are the live drums feel different than programmed drums. We achieve it using playback. So we have programmed stuff. We never duplicate anything. Like the band that I'm mixing has live drums on the record. But where there's programmed drums, the programmed drums are going to play it, or he's going to play those sounds on pads.
Right.
So we want the energy, we want to reproduce the record and the energy of the record, albeit in a more sort of punchy, up forward way. We have 2 guitar players, but we also have playback guitar tracks, and they're going to play underneath the guitar player because some of the effects that we built on the record, we can't recreate them live. And all the swishy things like and explosions and build-ups, all that stuff is on playback. So that's still all there. So it's a recreation of the record, but with more live elements. And I went to see Taylor Swift a couple years ago, and what I loved about, and I didn't know who was mixing, and I still never looked it up, but I couldn't tell where the band and the playback met.
Okay.
It was coming at me as one big piece, and I thought that's a great achievement because it didn't feel like 2 different things. And so that's what I'm trying to strive for. And even as far as like, we have some songs that have like distorted vocals in them, and so I use the distorted vocal on playback and blend it so you still hear him singing in the room, and it doesn't sound exactly like the record, but the playback vocal with that texture on it is playing a little bit behind. So the vibe of it and the mojo of that concept is still there, but it's not the main thing you hear. But then when he sings the chorus and it's like the big version of the vocal, you still get that dynamic shift in like texture shift. So it feels like the record.
Yeah, that element's still there that people are going to recognize who've heard the album version. So what kind of experience of, I don't know who wants to go first with this, what kind of experience have either of you got with different genres of music? Because this kind of plays into a question that I asked on or brought up on Goes to 11, which was methods of improving critical listening, and something that I brought up a long time ago, and I think it was Scott Adamson had said that he thought of doing something along those lines, was a question about how people approach different genres of music. So do either of you have any kind of strong experience of mixing wildly different genres of music? And if so, what were the differences in your approach between mixing those genres?
Do you want to go, Kim, or should I go?
Oh, you go ahead.
Okay, so I feel very strongly that you got to know where you came from. I'm not from Nashville. I don't mix country records, and it's not that I don't understand what the sounds are, but my sensibilities aren't built for that. And I love country music, but it's not my reference point, and I don't know what's right when I'm listening to, like, if I were to mix it, it's going to end up sounding more like a pop or a rock record. Yeah. Because that's what I do. And I was a musician, and I was in a band that played urban music for almost 10 years that was from New Orleans. And so my reference point, I live in Canada now, but I get a lot of the urban mixes in this neck of the woods because I know what it's supposed to sound like, and I don't have to listen to the latest thing that came out on Spotify, which I do because I want to stay current, and I like it. But I try and mix music, and you can't always do this, but I try and mix music that I get and that I understand. And after a little while, I think that stuff sort of comes to you if you're doing a good job and you get it. I live in Vancouver, and every 80s, early 90s hair band record that was made here. Okay. All Motley Crue, Bon Jovi, like all of those records were made here. There was a particular studio, and everybody came to work because of the reverb that they had, which was a loading bay, and the producers that were here, and Bob Rock was mixing. A loading bay? there's Little Mountain Sound had this famous loading bay reverb. Like it was like a huge chamber. They just turned it into a huge chamber, and everybody came because they wanted that sound.
Wow.
And it was it's still there now. It's been carved up into smaller pieces. But the point is, I know all those guys, but I don't actually fit into that community at all, which is kind of cool because I'm not competing with any of those guys for any of that work.
Yeah.
Like, AC/DC was just here a little while ago mixing a record, and this guy named Mike Fraser, who initially was like sweeping the floors in that studio, is now mixing those records. I'm never going to get that record. Like that's not coming my way. But I think it's important to get to know at least something and focus on. Dave Pensato, who's a really famous studio engineer, says, and it really resonates, that he says, I don't get paid for my skills, I get paid for my taste.
Okay.
And it's the skills that enable me to put my taste onto a record. And that's why I get the work, and I was fortunate enough earlier in my career to actually have him mix a couple things that I had worked on. And he was very urban, and there was a lot of bass. And like, I would ask him questions, and it's like, do you think the ad-libs should be louder? No, nobody sings the ad-libs. And he was done with that. It's like, he just knew what sounded right. Yeah. And I thought, that's a really good lesson. He just knows, he has confidence. And sure, could he mix other things? Yeah, but that's what he does. Urban and pop urban kind of records is what he tends to get. And he knows what feels right, and that's what he gets. And Bob Rock is going to still do great rock records. They're going to sound a certain way, you know? So I think you got to know where you came from. And because if your instincts are off, the people who live in that world, they know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure where I came from in terms of musical heritage. Then I'm not sure what the northeast of England's.
I don't mean so much geographically, but what do you listen to, and what do you like, and what you listened to when you were in high school? You probably listened to a lot of a certain thing.
Yeah.
Even though they may not be doing that now in your career, what came after that in that genre, you get it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about you, Kim? Have you mixed many different styles, or have you found yourself in somewhere that fits?
I think in live, it's been a real mixed bag. you know, just a lot of my background was in like venue sound, where you get a new thing every night and you just kind of have to like work with that. So sometimes it would be a rock band, sometimes it'd be a pop band, sometimes it's country, especially in Nashville, you know, there's a lot of country. And just kind of rolling with that. And then in the studio world, it's been a lot of rock, just because that's who's around me. I'm married to a rock drummer, and that's how things go in this house. But I don't know, as far as genre, I think I find myself mainly thinking about, what does this audience or this client expect to hear? You know, like in the tour that I just did, it was a singer-songwriter where like he was the star, you know? So the focus at all times is that lead vocal, you know? Or if you're working with a band where the guitarist has a huge following, as like, you know, there's the lead vocal, but there's also the guitarist, you know? Focusing on that, making sure that when the crowd is listening, they can hear what they want to hear, whatever that might be, you know? And in different genres, it's different things. Like in the country thing, getting that high-end definition on the acoustic instruments so that people can hear what kind of licks are going on there. The drums are not that important. So, you know, just kind of more of a general question of balance, I think, is what I think about most working in different genres. What is important at any moment in time, you know? But I think developing a specific sensibility is still a work in progress. It's always a work in progress, but.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure everyone's seen, you know, you can get posters where it's like frequency cheat sheets, and it'll be, you know, your guitar lives in this band, and kick drum lives in this band. And I'm surprised that I've never seen sort of genre mix cheat sheets where it's like basic kind of levels for different instrument types depending on genre. You know, snare up here and guitar down here for one, and the other way around for the other. Yeah, I mean the reason that I bring up different genres is, like I said earlier, I've been trying to put together a standard show file template since pretty much since our government announced the lockdown, which I think was March 23rd.
Yeah, I'm sort of in the same zone as you, maybe a week earlier.
Yeah. So what I've been trying to do is I've been sort of downloading as many multi-tracks as I can get my hands on I'm now trying to do it in as many genres as possible. I was kind of falling into the trap of just mixing things that I liked the sound of when I listened to the preview.
Yeah.
And then I realized that I probably wasn't benefiting so much from doing it that way around. What's been quite interesting lately is I've been trying to see, because I've based this template show file on a standard kind of rock band layout, and then lately I've been trying to run totally different styles of music through this same show file, where it's the same channel layout and the same sort of busing structure, and trying to work out how different I need to make things and how many adjustments, if any, need to be made, whether or not I need entirely different plug-in chains for electronic instruments versus acoustic instruments, or whether or not I could, at a push, get away with using as much of the original show file as possible. And that's been a really interesting kind of experiment. I did all of those YouTube links I posted the other day, Steve. They were by no means like perfect mixes, and they weren't in any way kind of mastered. But my philosophy with all of this setup has been to only use what mix tools I would have available live. There's been no editing. There's been no chopping bits out of tracks. I've tried to stay away from, even though I've got Waves tune real time, I've tried to stay away from it, and I've tried to be mindful of other things that might trip me up with building a show file in my house, like watching how much makeup gain I'm putting on compressors, particularly on moving objects like vocalists, where, you know, if I've made a bit of a mistake with makeup gain on an instrument mic, I could kind of correct that and get it to a point where it works in a live situation. But I might just be chasing my tail all day if I've got if I've got a compressor on a vocal input, and then again on a vocal bus, and then I've got compression on the master bus, and, you know, I might just be kind of whirling around trying to find out which compression or which EQ, or, you know. So I've also been trying to limit what, like as you were saying there, Steve, it's there's a fair few deep cuts, but I've been trying, certainly recently, I did have quite a lot of boosts on things like toms, and they were boosting, you know, I would say probably a good 8 or 9 dB easy, and I looked at them the other day, and I just thought, I think I should probably tame them down a little bit and sort of revisit those boosts when I'm in a situation where I've actually got live mics on stage. But yeah, all of those tracks that were put up on YouTube, they were done with as little variation in the show file as possible. It's been really interesting using that combination of the gain structure setup that Robert Scoville talks about in, I don't think the video is even on his own channel. It's on
I think it might be on Avid's channel.
Right.
Yeah.
So he talks about the benefits of gaining to line level, and the fact that your analog to digital converters are tied to your resolution's tied to your input gain and all the other benefits. It goes through everything. So I've tried to work through that as much as possible. And there's a video, it must be 10 years old now, an old Dave Rapp video where he talks about how he had his busing set up, how he groups instruments. And a lot of my buses at the moment are very similar to those that he described in that video. And I've found following, and this may all, like your, like how you described snapshots, this may all change a lot when I actually hit a live situation. But it's surprising, like, when you're not trying to get to a studio quality end product, it's surprising how little has to change. Now, I'm not saying that because I want to go into every live situation and not have to do anything. I don't want to just, gain up. That's it. That's the show done. But it's been an interesting kind of experiment where things like gates for drums are set, and that's all reliant on gain structure. If you gain to the same.
Dude, I think it's a worthy goal, because don't look at it as being lazy. Look at it as being efficient, because I don't think everybody who does live sound, there's never been a day where I thought, wow, I've got so much time. Like I got in so much crap before we finished. We were at a theater and the theater went dark, and I kept working when all the union guys took their break and I was still working. They were so mad at me. And it's like, I just want to sit here. I got a show that's going to happen, and it doesn't sound good yet. So fuck off and let me get this sounding okay. Jesus, it's like.
Oh,
so yeah, I mean, the majority of things seem to be kind of working. Drum grouping is working fine. I'm running a kick snare group, a toms group, and a metals group. They run into a kit group and a kit crush group. Then I've got a bass group, a guitars group, a keys group, a backing vocals group, a miscellaneous group, and a band group. And then I've got a separate lead vocals group. And then that goes into the master bus, where I've got more plugins than most people that talk about how many plugins they've got on their master. And it was funny. Did anyone watch the Pooch masterclass thing on the Waves website the other day?
I caught most of it.
Yeah, where he was going through the Slash recordings. I mean, that was interesting for me, because I was watching quite a lot of that, and he was bringing up plugins, and he had maybe 3 plugins on his master bus. But when I listened to what he was actually doing with each of them, it sounded from his description that he was doing almost exactly on his master bus what I'm doing on mine. He's just doing it with fewer plugins.
Yeah.
He was using the Abbey Road Master and Chain
of course
plugin, which I only have the small impact server, and I'm hitting the CPU in that pretty hard at the moment, so I can't. A lot of the Abbey Road stuff just eats processing power. Are either of you two doing anything on your master bus? Because I always find that's like a very, not divisive, but it differs quite a lot. Some people do an awful lot, whether it's that there is an awful lot going on in the master bus, but also whether or not people are mixing into the plugins in the master bus, or whether or not they're adding them once they're already happy with their mix. What's your thoughts on
that? In a live setting, I mean, almost everything that I do is, I forget who said it, but somebody on the summit said it's a dial and smile show, you know? And I feel like in those situations, I could put something on the master bus, but man, I mean, the dynamics of the show are changing so much. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm definitely not going to want to mess around with doing anything too extreme. So probably, I mean, I'll occasionally do like a master just simple compressor just to catch anything that kind of peeks out of there, or just as a safety net, if something takes off. But I don't really do a lot. I think if I had more time and a more controlled show environment, I think I could definitely see myself getting into more of that, because when I'm doing stuff in Pro Tools or mixing
that was going to be my
records,
next question, whether or not there's anything.
That's been an evolving process. So right now, I'm doing like an API 2500 type plugin as my like the first of the last compressors, and then a meter, and then it's kind of shameful, but I've been using like an ozone mastering plugin as kind of like just like a quick master almost. And I have to say, like, it's not best practices probably, but I do like to mix through something like that, because it kind of helps to put everything in perspective, that I don't need to do as much because it is going to get mastered and there is going to be more processing on top. So I think it also helps when I'm sending reference mixes to the band, because they don't immediately say, it feels quiet,
Yeah.
But then eventually, I feel like as the mix gets closer, I try to like back that off and kind of wean myself off of that master bus processing. And I mean, ideally, I would love to be the kind of mixer that it's perfection into the master and like no other excess processing needs to happen. But there is some sort of magic about that last like gluing stage, I've seen people, one of the engineers that I work with at one of the venues, he's been really into using like a tape emulator, just like really mildly on the very end of his chain. And I would love to try that when shows happen again. There's a lot of stuff that I'd like to try. Again, it's just about finding a situation where there's not so much other stuff that's taking priority and, potentially causing a dangerous situation.
Looks like Scott's joining us again.
Ooh.
I mean, this is exactly the reason why I've been trying all these things. And again, I know there's limitations to doing it in your own house with recorded tracks. But again, just trying to mix different things and seeing like, I've got a plugin chain of 5 plugins there. Am I having to swap them out every single time I mix a new track or a new artist? And it's been surprisingly easy to leave the vast majority of things in. The API 2500's been that's been one of the things that I've been built into my show file, because one of the things that I've been trying to go for is muscle memory, and I decided that as much as possible within my show file, certainly on the wave side, this is that I was going to limit the amount of different plugins I was using. So I thought, right, well, because I'd gone through all the different websites. What's the best compressor for bass guitar? What's the best compressor for a snare? And I'd loaded up all the racks with these different compressors, the LA2A, the 76. And I just thought, you know what, I'm gonna see how long I can go with an API on every point where I want a compressor. And get to the point where I'm perfectly comfortable mixing whatever multi-tracks I download, and get to the point where I can do that, and then maybe start sort of swapping out, maybe try the SSL bus comp on drums, or go for something a bit different, kind of building that muscle memory, but also knowing, maybe getting to grasp what my own mixes sound like a little bit more before I start playing with different plugins, just so that I can actually hear those differences a bit more. But what's your master bus picture looking like? Are you doing much, a lot, nothing?
So live, I'm going first into an API 2500, like the plugin. And because I like the mid thrust. feeling, I think is really nice. I have experimented with using the SSL plugin, but I felt like the character of the API gave me like the aggression that I was looking for.
Yeah.
And I like this sort of sense of mid-forwardness of it.
Are you doing a lot of reduction, or are you mostly just,
Tuple
doing a
DB.
little? Yeah, cool.
Just kind of want the transients to pop against it and
Mhm.
everything to kind of glue up just a little bit. And then after that, I go outboard and I go to Sonic Farm Creamliner, which is tubes. And Sonic Farm is here in Vancouver, and I know the guy really well. And I have some of their gear. And Chris Raybould also uses one, and that's actually was sort of like a jumping off point for speaking with him.
Mm-hmm.
But that with SC48 really helps. It's a bit of a brittle board. It's like a 10-year-old Pro Tools rig. It sounds like an 8/8, and it helps thicken everything up. It just makes it sound a bit more substantial. And then I'm kind of just going back and forth between using a C6 on the mix. And Pooch has a setting in there which is really interesting. I feel like I'm getting more RMS, so the mix feels louder without being louder. And it also gives you a way to operate it sort of like a crossover, because it's got 4 sections, and if I feel like the high mids are getting generally, I do that in my studio mixing a lot. I use multibands to compress the shape of the tonality instead of EQing. So I do that a lot. And then I have just a regular, like the Pro Tools or Avid EQ3, or is it EQ7? EQ7, just as the last thing, just in case I have problems.
Cool.
Yeah. I hear a lot of people talk about the C6. I've got the C4, and I was going to go and invest in the C6, but instead went for the F6, which I use on almost everything, but there seems to be far fewer people talking about it than the C6. One thing that I've started using is the NLS plugins. Do either of you have any experience with those? Was that a nod of the head there, Steve?
Yeah, so I stole a concept from this guy named Jason Joshua, who is like the preeminent pop urban guy for the last few years. Dave Pensado was his mentor.
Okay.
He uses 8 of those on his drum bus.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What is it?
It's like bus emulation. So there's an SSL, there's a Neve.
Got it.
And so he hits them just a little bit, but he stacks 8 of them.
Yeah.
And he talks about it in a mix with the masters, and he got it from a guy who does mixes for Mike Will Made It. And so he got this mix, and he was like, "What is this? This must sound horrible."
Yeah.
And then he took them off, and he was like, "And then the drums went away."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Oh my God." So he says, "So I tried 1, so I tried 2, so I tried 3, and I put back all 8 back on, and it sounded awesome." So I was like, I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
So I've actually stolen that. It creates a lot of high mid aggression. So in certain settings, I actually find it a little too much. But I'll try 1 or 2. But I also like the Slate emulations, and they're a bit more subtle, and I just use 1. So I'll sort of go back and forth. But yeah, I like the NLS, but it's a fairly, at least using it that way with 8 of them, it's a fairly aggressive vibe.
See, I've only very recently started. I've owned the pair of, because so Kim, because you've not used it, I'll explain a little bit further. It comes in 2 parts. There's the NLS channel, which emulates an input channel on any of the 3 given consoles. There's 32 channel emulations per console, so you can pick different consoles. So each one sounds very slightly different. So there's the channel element, and then there's the bus element. The bus element So within either element, you can change which VCA group it belongs to, and then within the bus plugin, you've actually got VCA controls. So it actually turns into a mixer within the plugin, which I don't really use it for, but I had tried the channel part of the channel plugin a long time ago when I first got Waves. Now I just tried like one channel plugin, like one instance of it on one input, and just thought, well, that doesn't do anything. And then never touched it again. And then recently, I just thought to myself, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick one on every input, see if it adds up, and then I started to think, well, I kind of like this. I'll try the bus part of the equations and see what that does. And then one thing that I really liked when I started using the bus part of the plugin was I wasn't actually using the faders of the VCA control section. But what you can do is you can, by VCA group, you can control which console emulation it is. So, I mean, I've got all of my inputs set to the same VCA group, so I'm doing it globally, but you could do VCA group 1 is drums, VCA group 2 is bass guitar, blah, blah, blah. And you can change from that bus plugin, you can change which console emulation all of your group 1 plugins are. So once I'd worked out that you could do that, once I'd found that out, I set the bus plugin to the first console and set the VCA group to the first console and saved that as a preset. Changed the bus console to the second console, and the same with the VCA group. Saved that as a preset, and the same with the third console. So now I have 3 presets in the bus plugin that's on my master bus, where with the preset I can just change between 3 consoles across all of my inputs and the master bus. And when you change that many elements all at once versus what I was doing back in the day with one plugin on one input, it's a fairly vast. I mean, for Steve, I would equate it to what we did recently with Scott Adamson and the comparison between the SD10 and the S6L. And so one of the things I am doing now is I'm working my way through a mix in this template. Once I've gone through and done my band bus and then done my vocals and done my vocal bus, and I'm happy with the mix, and I get to the master bus and I activate all those plugins. I try that exact mix with the 3 different consoles and find out which one sounds the best for that given track. And that's been I've only been doing that for the past, I would say, probably a week, but it's felt like someone's just given me a whole load of sort of gear that I never had before, and it's amazing because it's just been sat in my available plugins for it's got to be at least 5 years, and I'm a little bit ashamed that I haven't done it already, but I was quite impressed.
What's cool about it, it's like free vibe, right?
Yeah.
It's like it would be hard to construct that otherwise. I do the same thing. I use the Slate ones for my studio setup. I don't have the SC48 won't run all the modern wave stuff, but I have it set up so I can switch the whole thing to a Neve or an SSL. And what's interesting about it, to me, at least the first time I used something like that a long time ago, is I thought I didn't know what an SSL console sounded like.
Right.
I've sat in front of them a lot. And as soon as I did that, I was like, oh, I do know what it sounds like.
Yeah.
I just didn't know that I did. And it's like, oh, I really like that. Especially for rock records, there's that mid-range anger is awesome.
Yeah. It's funny that those are the 2 that are available to you, because those are the 2 out of the 3 choices I've got. Those are the 2 that I seem to be consistently going to. The middle one, the mic, which I think is an EMI.
It is.
I kind of try that every time. I try all three of them every time, but I'm not sure if I've ever actually stuck with that console and just thought that sounds like the best out of the three for
It's
this.
the model. That console is the one that was used on a couple of Pink Floyd records, if memory serves.
Right.
But you know, that SSL is just, it's a sound, you know, and it really works, and it's punchy, and it really does a certain thing to certain kind of records, and the Neve sound is kind of big and more harmonics, and it's like a very definite thing also, and so it's just like they're two very particular strong vibes, and you get a sense, at least I do, like that works for this really well, and then I just go with that usually.
Yeah. I think it was remarkable, the amount, like the difference it made when you are changing the plugin setting on every input and on the master bus at the same time. It was definitely an audible change in tone. Hi, Scott.
Hi, Liam. Hi, Steve. Hi, Kim.
How you doing?
Good. It's just also this whole discussion, like the three of you were talking about waves, servers, and all this, and it's like I've never seen in person, to my knowledge, a wave server. I know what they are. I hear you all talk about them. I think maybe I glanced one when a Broadway show came through my area, but I've never had hands-on. So it's an option I've always liked to have, but I've never been able to use it. I have Waves plugins on my computer, and so I know what the C6 does and a bunch of these things, but I've had to learn how to use either the inboard, the channel effects, or what premium effects that, you know, the board has. And so I've had to set up my workflow a whole lot differently, which has its advantages and disadvantages. One, I never have the stress of a wave server crashing on me. Not saying that they do, because Liam and I had an interesting discussion being like, all soundboards, whether they be analog or digital, break at some point. But it's interesting, Steve, you mentioned the SSL and, like, you know, Pink Floyd, and then how Neves is a different sound. Because for me, if someone asked me what the best drum sound ever put to tape or computer ever was, I would say Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana, which was recorded on a Neve console. To me, my ears love the Neve sound. So my favorite board, the Yamaha QL series, Yamaha went the Neve route. So I'm always trying to go for that kind of sound, but it's not just, are we still kind of like talking about workflow? Like, what kind of topic did I come in on?
We're making our way through workflow, which has gone from gain structure to macros to automation, through to plugin use, to the differences between live and studio work. So yeah, I mean, if you want to go back through any of those, and give your side of things, then that'd be great.
So for most of my stuff, you do what Pooch likes to call smile and dial. I can count on one hand the amount of times I've done a show where I had the same act or same group the same day. They have all been a musical. I've yet to have, unfortunately, a band. Anything else that I had repeatedly was either theater. I can name them, working, the producers. I'm spacing on my other musical I did, but those were the only ones. So, and even then, I had so much going on. I wasn't really caring. I might like the musical. I'll take the producers as my best example of the most channel count off the top of my head where I've been bored on. I only cared about, all right, is everything, can I hear everything? Is there no feedback? And like at the most I had compression. I think on one scene I attempted to do a verb, but I abandoned it because I was like, this has to sound good. Because I was also RF tech on that technically. So it's that scenario. And I'm sure and I never had a full tech day on that. I had one tech rehearsal and that I did through that, but on the more musical thing. So it's like, I have to go with focusing on gain structure. And if I have the luxury, I'll add, like, my most common one is some verbs where I'll have a room, a hall, and just depending on the act, I might add a delay or some other verb that the Yamaha CL series has on board, and just kind of go with that. And just though for my workflow, what I do use to kind of make things better is I heavily lean on my DCA groups, VCAs, whichever one you want to call them, just because, and I love how it for that, because you'll get your, you get your drums. We'll start with, I give a drums, depending on how many other instruments I might give. I'll give a guitar group, I'll give vocals, especially if there's more than one vocalist. Even technically, if there is one vocalist, I still will deem the vocal group just to give kind of my right hand has the focus while everything's there. And often, depending on the boards too, sometimes my channel counts, I'm not always on the CL. So my channel counts go into the next layer. So having the VCA, DCAs are, to me, great. And I lean heavily on color coordination. Typically, I do blue, often will default to drums. Green, I do guitars. Sometimes keys get purple. Horns, it's whatever I'm feeling that day. But no matter what, the one guaranteed one, vocals red. Because to me, unless I'm doing an instrumental group, I prioritize vocals are the most important thing, because it's the one thing on stage that has no real amplification by its nature. If this PA shut off suddenly, your average rock and roll group, everything has some kind of amplification. The drummer, bass player, guitar player, so on. Vocalist doesn't. So I always prioritize that. And I always kind of try to make the vocals sit on top of everything. And I just love the idea too with VCAs and DCAs. And I don't know what, I know Midas does it and Yamaha does it, where you hit your DCA and it just spills out to that. And it helps me focus solely on what that group is incredibly helpful. But I've been slowly, just to talk on more of the plugins, and obviously I use the default compressors, and I kind of, I just want the compressor to kind of do some work. I very rarely have my compressor hit more than 5, 10 if I'm using it as a limiter, but it's just like most often there's so many, and often, even if I know the act, like the one act I did last, Malmaise, which is a world music group, I knew their music, but I was still like, I don't know how dynamic it's really going to be, because it'd been like a good year since I'd mixed them. So, and I always watch them too. Is like, that's what I also like. I don't know what other budget, but at least the Yamaha, and I think the M32 on the channel strip will tell you how hard your compressor is hitting. And I've at least gotten somewhat good to hear that sound of, okay, the vocals over compressed, let me, do it that. But I'm trying to think what else I do in mine. But one thing I found out during, like, what I want to start doing once we get shows again is that Dave Ratt was talking about, like, we've all done this method of sound check. Give me the kick, give me the snare, each individual one. We've all done it. I don't care. Everyone has some point done that version of sound check, and I'm just as guilty. I slightly do it differently. In fact, I always do vocals first because I find it helps to communicate with the band better, because they can then tell me, hey, I can't hear this or what's going on, because oftentimes I end up being front of house and monitors at the same time. And just communication helps the whole thing, kind of going back to like Pooch's whole bit of greet with a handshake, not a talk back, but that's more that, but just on the communication. So I always like having that. But I'm what I've actually been doing when I've been practicing with multi-tracks is I used to do the whole, when they teach you in recording, start everything at 0 and then pull up everything. I've now started to everything at unity, but I pull my master fader way down, do it as a search to make sure, okay, what already seems to be, what's poking out, what's drowned, and then start really moving things. I very rarely will keep anything at unity, just because I think that leads to loudness, but just knowing that idea of like, what's going on in the full picture, don't focus on the kick drum for half an hour. And let's see, I'm just trying to think how else I go in my workflow. Very rarely, unfortunately, just as mentioned, most of mine are smile and dial, so I can't really do a whole lot on my master bus. I'll do like your limiter, but that's about it. Though last time I got my hands on, which actually was about a week ago, I was experimenting with using some of the premium plugins, like figuring, okay, how much is this doing? And it was, I'm kind of going a little off track on this, but just figuring out what I'd love to do at 2 is investing, like figuring out how much you got to invest for that wave server is just insane. Like I would love to use some of these wave plugins I go, but I'm like, unless the board has it in there and there's already a server, it's like, I don't have the money. So I've, in a weird way, I'm not trying to put down the wave server thing. I think it's actually really great and all these options, but I'm like, I've had to learn using built-in plugins and figuring out, okay, instead of just like, oh, I'm going to throw insert waves on, I'm like, okay, what's the actual problem with it? Because I always try to find with my mixes, I always strive for how can I make this sound as natural as possible. Now, certain acts, I'm like, okay, that's out the window. Like take an industrial band, like i.e. Nine Inch Nails, that ain't going to sound natural. But take, your typical, like, I'll take a My Ease again. That was a world music group. You need those to sound more organic. And I just kind of, this is going to be a weird off topic, but it goes to my my mixing like workflow and everything. Is I absolutely despise contemporary Christian music. And this is coming from someone who's a practicing Christian. Why do I say that? If you listen to the music, it feels like a brick limiter is on it the whole time. It never has a peak. It never has a valley. It's just this, it's like brick wall, but boring. And I hate that kind of mixing. In fact, there's some music, even like secular music, that I'm just like, this bores me because I can't feel the intensity. I want my mix to kind of, that's why I also don't hit my compressors hard. I'll hit them, but I don't hit them hard because I'm like, I want that loud to be felt loud and that quiet to be quiet, within reason, of course. But that's my end goal at the end of the day, is like, I want it to sound as though the PA doesn't exist.
When you say premium plugins on the Yamaha, do the Yamaha consoles have same? We'll go back to the M32 or the X32. Do they have like a modeled sort of selection of plugins?
Well, first I'll answer about the premium. It's a name I hate Yamaha picked. You don't have to pay for them. You get the board, it's included. Yeah. Now, unlike Allen and Heath, where you then have to pay for it, but no, it's really a weird name they picked on it. But anyways, back to the M32, X32. Yeah, sorry, Liam, I went off on a tangent. What was kind of the question again about that?
So the same way that the M32 and X32 have their own. So Waves have got the CLA2A model of the original hardware version, and some other versions where if you look at them, there's a Fairchild compressor, and there's some others. Is that a similar sort of deal on the Yamaha consoles?
Yeah, there's definitely ones. Obviously, you mentioned Yamaha worked with Neve directly, so they have. It will say, if you bring up in the premium plugins, if you bring up Neve, it will say Neve, because Robert Neve himself, from what Yamaha reps have told me, Robert Neve worked directly with Yamaha to make sure that plugin worked. In fact, there's a story they said, "Oh yeah, when we were in the early development, he's like, yeah, you're close, but you're modeling this. I only use that 1 year. Use this one instead. This is what you're trying to model." Apparently, that's how good his ear is. Okay. But for me, my only time I will get brand loyalty is less brand disloyalty, and it was. In the weirdest way, is more of ergonomics. For me, I've been on all these different boards. Like I can shortly say I've been on the X32, M32, Midas Pro, obviously XCL QL series, Allen and Heath, QL, the QLD, which is an obscure one they had for a while, and the QU. And to me, each one of them, I always go back to it's your source. And the main reason I will hate a board is its ergonomics. My biggest gripe with the X32 is its ergonomics. Its sound I'm fine with. It's just its ergonomics. I don't like the way it is. But to get back to your point is, I don't really care about the brand of compressor. I don't like, to me, a certain bit, it goes back to also, I'm like, the whole reason I started all this was I would go to concerts and conventions and be like, this sounds awful. It wasn't be like, oh man, they're using the wrong compressor. I just went, it sounds bad. It's kind of like a baker going, I only use this brand of flour. I'm like, I don't care what brand you do. The cake tastes awful. So that's kind of also my bit of like, if it works, it works. Now there's a certain bit of certain companies I refuse to use due to ethical reasons, but most of the time I'm like, did I get a good result out of it? And are the people that are paying basically directly my paycheck or indirectly, are they enjoying what's going on? So I also feel the thing is a lot of these talks, which I love having, but at the end of the day, when we get back to, it's like, we are the 1% that can hear a difference. Does everyone in the crowd, the 99% of people in the crowd, are they able to hear? It's like, oh, well, no, that's a Waves, LL, whatever. I'm like, do they care at the end of the day? They care, does it sound good?
I think it's kind of like we were talking about, I don't think you were in here yet. It's kind of a cumulative effect, you know? Like you may not be able to hear the difference with one plugin, but can you hear the difference with 20, 30, 40 on every channel, you know? Like it may not matter what brand or what specific one, but I think there is a benefit certainly to processing and stacking processing. You know, you can get a noticeably better mix even for people with no training, you know. But again, it's like you were saying, like they only know it sounds good or it sounds bad. They don't know why.
Right. And I would, hopefully with COVID, because I have a place where I can now go that they have a CL and I can go there and try this out. I've usually only had enough time to throw EQ in basically the basics, gain, EQ, and a little compression to make sure it doesn't run away on me, and verb and delay for some flavor. So it's, again, not one of those things I try to put down. It's just I haven't had the opportunity. I would love to. And in fact, when Liam and I last week, we both found I found an Alicia Keys song, and we both mixed it. I mixed it on a CL5. He mixed it on his Digico. And I actually spent time and experimented a little bit. Like, okay, let's start stacking plugins because I now can focus like 2 hours on one song. So I'm also a creature of just my environment and what goes on. So
yeah, definitely.
Well, let me share a thought about plugins. Like, I would use an 1176 or an LA2A because I know it's going to impart a certain kind of character or sound. It's my job to know that. I don't expect anybody in the crowd to know that the compression has changed or what compression is. So you've all eaten a McDonald's hamburger and you've all gone to some high-end place where there's a chef and had a hamburger that was way, way, way better than that. It was the chef's job to figure that out. I don't know what was different about the bread or about the ketchup or about the cheese he used, because that's not what I do. But there's a huge difference because the guy who was doing it did something next level. That's our job when it comes to compression and EQ. It's not about do the people know how it was made, but certainly there's a difference when someone who really knows what they're doing is driving the machinery. It makes a difference, even though it might not seem like it, but there is a cumulative effect. And if you know what you're doing, I think having the right tools to deliver that can make a difference.
It kind of goes back to what you're saying about like taste and skill. Like it's your job to imagine how you want it to sound and then use whatever tools are at your disposal, whether it's, you know, not very much or a whole lot, in order to achieve as close as possible to that taste or that goal.
Right. And that's a big thing too, like, or not, right? Like pulling up a sound that sounds awesome and not ruining it is a part of it, right?
Yeah, totally.
So one thing I kind of through using Waves tried to work out which different brand models sounded better with different sources. And one thing through all of that I didn't really ever put the effort into learning was why a particular compressor sound. You know, it's usually that a VCA compressor will sound better on a given instrument, or an optical compressor will sound better on it. You know, and I think if you that's something I'm going to have to learn, because if you have that knowledge where a type of compressor is the sound that you're looking for, I want this type of compressor on my guitar bus, then you've then got you could have a range of compressors open to you where you can think, well, that's the same type, that's the same type, that's the same type. So between them, I can choose one of them without it necessarily being, well, I've heard of DBX, so I'm going to go for the 160. So it's informed decisions, I think, and knowing, yeah, again, like you said, Kim, it's knowing what you're going for. But the reason I asked about those plugins, Scott, whether or not they were like the way that the M32 has some modeled bits, is can you chain them? Can you have a plugin chain? Or are you limited? Because on the M32, you're limited to, or certainly you were the last time, unless have changed the firmware. You could insert one of the compressors onto a channel, but you couldn't then insert anything else. You couldn't have a vocal chain as such.
Yeah, because of the way the X30, because the M32 is basically just the X32 with nicer hardware. The guts are the same. So I'm bringing up the M32 Edit one, and basically how it works, if I got this, is you can't do change. You have, I think it's technically 4. You have, well, here's the thing. If
8.
you're doing them, yeah, you have 8. But though I immediately think the 4, because most of the time I do monitors from front of house. But if you're in the situation,
oh yeah.
And oftentimes too, I've, at least from what I've heard too, is like, even if you aren't the monitor engineer, you still need some of those EQs for system tuning. But we could get on that whole discussion show. Depending, you could at least get a good 6, but you can't stack them. You can group them, you can merge them, but you can't like. If I'm getting what you're trying to do, Liam, is like, let's say you have like one bus and you want to throw all the 3 different.
Yeah,
EQs.
what I'm asking is whether or not you can do it on the Yamaha. I know you can't form a plug-in chain on the Midas or the Behringer, but it was just that you said the Yamahas have what they call the premium plugins.
So
effectively, is there more than one insert?
Yeah, I know for sure there are at least, off the top of my head, you can at least do 2 on it for inserts. You can also, in addition, you can throw the effects on a bus. So you could have like a compressor, a multi-band compressor, and then a verb for just, but you would have to get to the third one onto a channel. But I think, if I remember how to, I've never experimented with it, but I think you could technically route multiple effects. Like let's say it's bus 13 is where you want to put your effects on. You could put a reverb and delay both on bus 13. You just got to route it correctly.
That's what it comes down to, is that you would have to do some fancy routing in order to do it. Like you could technically, like say you wanted to do like a chain on your lead vocal, you'd have to do like one insert on the channel and then route it to a bus and put another insert on that bus. Like it would be a hassle, basically.
Yeah.
Right. And next time I get my hands on the CL, which will probably be next week, I'll play with that, because again, I've only usually bust my like vocal ones to like, let's say I have my four vocal effects, and I would send the vocals to all 4 of the returns and just pull them up on the song. So in theory, you can easily, and I did this on one song where I had both a reverb and a delay going at the same exact time. So you can create that chain.
Speaking of effects, I was thinking, when we're talking about workflow, do you guys have like a standard effects rack that you load up? Like I know, Scott, you were saying you've got a couple reverbs and a delay that you pretty much always have loaded up. What about you other guys?
I do. So as part of this show file that I've been building, I've got a kick and snare verb that the pre-delay is synced to the global tempo, and a kit reverb. Well, all of my reverbs are the pre-delays are synced. So there's a kick snare reverb, then there's a kit reverb. I've got a guitars reverb and a vocal reverb. They are all H reverb, which is one of the main reasons that the CPU of my Impact server's getting kicked constantly. But yeah. And I'm running J37 as a tape delay, which is another CPU eater. Yeah, those have rarely changed for the past few weeks running these multi-tracks through them.
Are you doing different things with each of these different reverbs, like, you know, different lengths, different?
What, to each other or changing depending on?
If you've got, you know, a separate reverb, are you just keeping them separate, you know, to keep it more pure, or are you doing different things with different reverbs?
Yeah, so the kick snare reverb is I can't remember off the top of my head. It's 1.8 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Then the kick verb is the same. The kick snare one's usually a bit shorter.
Mm-hmm.
And then the guitar verb is quite short. That's only about a second. But the reason I use the guitar verb is I've got the sends flipped, and it's a stereo reverb, so that if I pan a guitar fairly hard left, I get the reverb of it over on the right hand side. And I find that if I've got 2 or 3 guitarists in a track, I can pan them fairly aggressively, and you know, this is one of them things that I'll probably have to tame down when I get it, certainly on the bigger stages. But I can pan fairly aggressively until I quite like the sound of it, and then start sending to a flipped stereo reverb, and it kind of fills in bits of gaps over on the other side. Cool. Which just fills out the sound a little bit. There's not much of a, like I say, it's only about a second. It's kind of just almost closer to a delay than a reverb, but it does have a little bit more of a tail. The vocal reverb is probably 2 seconds, 2.5 seconds. But yeah, those are all synced with the pre-delay to the. Now, I've never understood why you can't sync the total reverb time. So say if you wanted your kick snare reverb to be a quarter note length, well then from a tempo, you would think that it would be able to do the maths and work that time out.
I've never thought of it like that way, to think about your reverb as, you know, the same way that you would with a delay, like a meter value.
Yeah.
It's always just been second value.
Yeah. Because I've seen videos on YouTube of people telling you how to work out the perfect reverb time so that it kind of, the tail of it finishes in time with the music. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. And I've kind of tried doing it manually, and I like the sound of it. But as far as I'm aware, there's no actual reverbs that you can just say, yeah, I want the pre-delay to be 64th note, and I want the total time to be a quarter note or a half note, or, you know, whatever. I'm not sure of the reasons why that hasn't been designed. There's probably plenty of reasons that it hasn't been done. But yeah, so there's four reverbs and 1 delay. The delay rack in multi-rack has got the J37 and H delay. So if I just want to do like delay throws, I can snapshot change. I wanted a whole separate rack, but I'd kind of used up all my sense. But yeah, cool. I'm fairly conservative with the effect, reverb and delay. I mean, I've got things in the available plugins. There's things like the what's the Abbey Road ADT, the automatic doubler thing, which I think I like the sound of, but you've kind of got to be careful with it. It's easy to push it a little bit too far and have it sound like really obvious. But yeah, other than that, that's you know, kick and snare, full kit, guitars and vocals. The kick and snare reverb runs through the kick and snare group. The full kit just runs through the full kit group. I was I was running vocal effects back, the return back through the vocal bus, because I'd read a few people talking about how you should run the returns back through the bus of whatever instrument the effect is on, to kind of glue it all together. But I was finding that if I had moments in the song where there was quite a big swell of reverb, it would hit the compressor before the vocal did, the compressor on the vocal bus, and then I would kind of have the lead vocal just getting squashed by its own reverb. So what I've done is I've separated them out and just put a compressor on the reverb sidechain to the vocal bus, so the reverb's not sort of swimming over the top of the vocal, but also isn't smashing into the vocal's own compressor. That's pretty much my effects. That's
cool.
They're all pretty straightforward.
It's interesting how you mentioned drum reverb, and I've unfortunately yet to be able to implement it. I'm actually going to share my screen because this is the average. Let's see here. If we're getting, that is the average size of the venue I work at, is this one. So being able to pull off a reverb there for drums just would kind of like, people go, even if they're not audio people, you're like, what the hell is going on here? So you go, what? And so I've always, well, my image is just okay.
Do it, man. Just do
no,
it.
no,
Just
sorry.
stick reverb on everything.
Yeah, no. I actually I usually every show, even if it's the most smile and dial ever, I use reverb on the vocal. Though I'm also really careful with it. Even when I'm going out with my iPad, I'm just playing that game of slowly before it gets, because unless you're doing an 80s tribute group, you have to be really careful with that verb. I found, especially in smaller rooms, you can get away with it in the bigger ones because people are well, there's kind of a natural reverb anyways.
Yeah. And that's where, that's one of these things, going back to that conversation we were just having about different brands of compressors, things like reverbs, for me anyway, you can hear the difference between, that's why I'm using H-verb, because you can hear the difference between a bad reverb plugin and a good, I mean, I don't have any experience with Bricastis or any major outboard gear. We had some Yamaha outboard reverbs in the venue I worked at, and they were kind of badly looked after. And there's Steve showing off his
Steve.
they were badly looked after, so all the buttons were a little bit poorly, so I tended not to use them.
Yeah, the few events I've even had an external effects unit, I was it's a similar situation. It didn't matter the brand, where it's just I don't know how well this was taken care of. I'm not gonna risk it.
Yeah, Steve, when you're doing shows on your SC48, what do you use? Because I know the few shows that I've done on an SC48, the onboard reverbs are. I couldn't find one that I liked.
So I'm using Revibe for drums.
Okay, yeah.
It's very noisy, which I like for drums because you really hear it.
Yeah.
It's like a guitar solo. It's so noticeable. but it's a texture thing. I'm not really trying to get space. I'm trying to make the drums sound longer. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then for vocals, I'm using the R-verb. It's got the Waves one.
Yeah.
And so I use that. And again, it's more pretty short. Most of the venues I'm working at, I don't need more space. It's lots of that already.
Yeah.
So just it's more I'm thinking thickening agent, just to make it more, and then delay, and I'm experimenting with doubling and pitch, and I'm not very satisfied with the results like in my studio, I like it. And then I've gone to venues and it's like, it's just not, it's too subtle.
Yeah.
So I don't know where I'm going to end up with that yet. So it's a work in progress. I'm not especially satisfied. I really only, I mean, the SE48 just doesn't have a lot in it. So I'm trying to work that out. In the studio, I have a Bricasti and I have the Lexicon emulations, which is 90% of the time what I'm using on vocals. They're not intrusive and they sound good. I like the Lexicon actually more than the really expensive Bricasti most of the time. It just has a texture that makes it feel a bit magical, and I use the Valhalla one for long reverb, the vintage verb.
Yeah.
Like half of hip hop is on that reverb. Like if you turn it up, you'll be like, oh yeah, that's the sound.
Yeah.
So
where does everyone stand on saturation?
I like it a lot.
Yeah. What are you using it for, Steve?
I use it on the whole mix.
Yeah.
With so the Creamliner is saturation.
Oh yeah.
Tube saturation. It's also got output transformers like a Neve, so I can do that also. And then I use like the Avid plugin Lo-Fi. I will put on a vocal just a little. It will help it cut through a little bit. I will put that on drums. So yeah, I don't have that many options with the SE48, but I'm out of. So on my SC48, I have to take something off to put something else on because I just run out of resources. But like even tape saturation, I'll use a lot on studio mixes. It's kind of like what you were talking about with the NLS. It's cumulative. So if you put one or two on, maybe not. But if you start to add a few more, it can help. It can get too much.
Yeah.
But yeah. But I do love it. I mean, I think it's a great way to get more aggression and more RMS and more polish. Like it's a really good way to get high end without turning to EQ, because the sparkliness of like tube distortion, it will add those upper harmonics like that will give you that that high, like that sparkly frequency that you like without adding EQ. And for me, I don't tend to love most of the PAs I've been on. I don't really love the high end, the character of it, generally speaking.
What about you, Kim?
I would love to be using more saturation live. It's been more a result of not really having a lot of options. I was messing around with the distortion saturation options on the M32 for my winter tour, but I just wasn't really like what Steve's talking about. Like none of them really had a high end situation. Like I would put it on and it would sound vibey and vintage and kind of broken down, but it would just get lost in the mix, you know? So I had a hard time, like I would have had to do a lot of compensating to make it come to the front, you know? It was like it was crushing it, but it was leaving it down here, you know? So I ended up not really following through on that idea for the whole tour. I think if I'd had more options, like in Pro Tools, when I'm doing these rock and metal mixes, I have a lot of saturation and distortion options. You guys should check out, there's this free plugin called the Camel Crusher. It's a lot of fun. If you're looking for like really destroyed sounds, it can be really fun to put just a little bit of that on things. Or Sound Toys' Decapitator. So good. I like every drum bus now has to have it, you know? And again, we're talking about recordings. I don't know if I would, if it was available on a board, I don't know if I would feel comfortable, just because it does change the sound so much. And especially when, like Scott was saying, a lot of the venues I work in are smaller, and like changing the drum sound so much and trying to combine that with the, you know, acoustic drums might get a little weird, but man, it just makes it instantly sound more done, you know? Sounds more finished. Man, I love it. Or like Devil Lock is another one that they have for saturation. And that's so fun on vocals or bass or, you know, any of that. So I think the answer is yes, if it is good.
The isotope exciter is super good too.
Oh, I haven't tried that. I need to.
Because you can do it in bands. Like you
Mm-hmm.
can arrange it like a multi-band compressor.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the tricks that I learned actually from Jason Joshua is just only saturate between 100 and 1,000. Especially for vocals that were recorded on not very expensive microphones.
Mm-hmm.
That's a part of what you like about expensive, the fullness of them. But without
Mm-hmm.
EQing more of that in, just creates a more harmonic texture. It's really
Cool.
good.
That's awesome. I'm gonna have to look into it. That's
Yeah.
on my list of pandemic to-dos, is to take advantage of some of these like plug-in sales while they're still on.
Yeah.
Like I know Waves, I get those emails every day, and I
they're
think
constant.
And I think I need to fight the temptation, but also I'm going to feel like such a fool if I don't buy anything and it ends, you know?
But if you have ozone, you already have it. It's built into that.
Oh, you're talking about just the
exciter inside ozone.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I was thinking it was a separate thing. But yeah, I do love to play around with that. I don't usually do very much with it though, because I'm using it as like the very last stage. And like I said, I'm trying to wean myself off of it.
No, try that just on a vocal channel, just like some warm or some tube between 100 and 1,000, and just a bit until you kind of feel like it feels a bit more substantial. It's really nice.
Cool. I'm gonna have to try that. Cool.
Well, from my experience with tape saturation, like J33, 37, like almost every single mix, unless I'm trying to get a sterile sound on purpose, I throw on my master bus, and I really play with, like, as mentioned, I think Kim and Steve, and I think kind of Liam, you all three kind of hinted that thing can also get really noisy. Oh yeah, Kim, you said it's squash. Now what I do with it, depending, if I'm doing it as a light sprinkle, I'll put it on the main. But the fun thing to really do with that, crank the saturation knob all the way. Don't turn noise up. Noise is this weird thing that I understand why Waves put it on there, but I have a situation where upping the noise made it sound good, because it's like the whole thing is like, I don't put it on every channel because it's like it's supposed to emulate a tape machine, which is like it's on every channel, but they didn't stick that as the effect. But anyways, one thing I will do, less on the it's less tape machine, but still saturation. I did this on one show and it actually was really beneficial. So I did on the bass. I think I actually did on the bass, the snare, and the kick. It's parallel compression where you just squash the living daylights out of one of the channels. Use the tape saturation, so you have your clean bass, and then you bring in, it's a trick, and then you slowly bring in the distorted one, because distortion does help the ear to hear things better. So you slowly bring that up, and it helps to cut through on the mix on that way. And that's also going to be another thing next time I get my hands on the CL, is I'm going to play with that tape, because it also has a tape one. I never touched the M32 one. I don't think I had much experience on that.
Yeah, I couldn't figure out how to make it sound the way I wanted it to. But
yeah, that's the thing. It's like, I love the X32 M32 board, but it has its limitation. It's at a certain price point, and I'm not putting it down. It's I love the thing and it's served me well, but it has its limitations to what it can do, especially in the routing, even with the firmware update. But yeah, that's how I kind of handle my tape saturation in both recording too. Is I'll just in Reaper I'll double it and use that oftentimes, or just when I'm just sprinkling it.
I've recently been going back to the NLS plugins on the NLS channel. Steve, have you tried hitting that mic button on there? Because apparently that's
on the NLS.
Yeah.
The preset mic or the MIC?
No, sorry,
mic?
MIC. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I haven't. Yeah,
it's from what I've read, it's to emulate putting a line level input through the mic preamp.
Gotcha.
So you've kind of got to be really careful with the level going into it, because otherwise it just sounds terrible. But one thing that it does do is really, really close the gap between your RMS and peak on something like a snare, like massively, massively closes that gap. You know, you're walking a fine line with how much you can do, because like I say, it just destroys it if you take it too far. But it's good for kind of bringing those transients down and just being able to get a lot more punch out of that kick for a lot less, you know, overs in the system. But one thing I've been playing with recently, have you used the Aphex Oral Exciter?
So no, SPL has sort of a different version of it, which I use. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been running that on my master bus recently, just because you mentioned their sort of sparkly bits, which I'm kind of getting from that at the moment. But again, this is another plugin that's been in my library for years and years, and I've just never touched it until recently.
That kind of thing scares me a bit. It's kind of like sugar. It's like more. I just ripped my own head off. It's like
It's it takes some playing with as well, because for such a really sort of basic layout with what looks like not an awful lot of controls, just the fact that there's on the Waves version, there's mix 1, mix 2, and a send return version where you just get the wet version.
I see.
So it's kind of like if you're just inserting it on something and you want to find out which one you prefer, it's not even, because on the Digicores there's the touch and turn controls where I've got a pot on the SD9 where if I select a pot on a compressor, for instance, I can turn the pot with the but then there's a button next to it where some of the controls you have to use a button and it kind of switches between, and that's one of those controls. So it's not where you can just A/B it backwards and forwards. You've kind of got to cycle through them one at a time. And I keep getting to that point where I'm like, oh yeah, I quite like mix 1. Let's try mix 2. Yeah, mix 2's all right. Let's try the send return. Then you get back around to mix 1 and you just think, I can't remember what the last one sounded like now. So you just spend about 20 minutes just pressing this button. Oh, I don't know what I'm doing now. Yeah. But yeah, I've just added in a little bit of sort of high-end sheen just before I go into that NLS bus. And yeah, it's great at the moment, but this is all part of me having a play around. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about, Scott, or Kim, or Steve?
Well, one thing I think, I don't know, because I was gone for a chunk of this, did we talk about automation at all and people's experiences with it?
Yeah, we dug into that pretty good.
Okay.
So most people are just doing mute and fader moves.
Yeah.
Which in the past has been almost entirely what I've automated. But I remember recently I was out for a walk listening to Spotify, and there was a song came on, and it started off with an acoustic guitar, and it was just an acoustic guitar, and then kicked into full band. And I started to kind of question whether or not it would be useful to automate like high pass filters. So bring the high pass filter further down for when the guitar's on its own, just to give it a little bit more body.
Right.
And then, as the band kicks in, probably raise that high pass filter up a bit and clean up all the bottom end. But then I've not really found any multi-tracks that I've been mixing for the past 3 months where I've needed to do that. So I haven't had a chance to experiment with it. What do you do, Scott? Well, if you're doing mainly one-offs, are you automating much?
Yeah, so automation for me goes into 2 big categories: theater and then music. So music, here's how much I use automation, unfortunately, is I use it for setup, sound check, and then I make a shutdown scene, which just mutes everything and turns off phantom power. Though I have used it in music for like festivals where it's like, I did one show a couple of months ago where it was a rock and roll camp showcase. So there was like 6 or 7 bands and on the M32, and man, those things saved my bacon, because like just having it pop up makes the biggest. So like like I didn't have to remember. Like I'd have to remember things. Okay, no, this band is this, but it's like it kind of was a weird thing that happened at one point. That was just due to a miscommunication, but pretty much it was still great knowing it's like boom, comes up, gain levels are set, channels are identified, everything I don't need is gone, everything I need is up, and that just I love being able to do that. And like whenever I've seen people. So one thing I've learned when doing theater, and I had to learn this lesson a few times, unfortunately, in the last show, it bit me, and it was the one where I had to finally learn the lesson, scene safes and channel safes of like, you're in musicals, if you only can gain save one thing, gain safe the gain, well, channel safe the gain, because that screwed me over on my last one, and that was the one that made me learn, okay, there's got to be a way to do this. And now, like, I was all ready to do right before before COVID. I was like, all right, I had another musical lined up. I'm like, all right, I'm going to practice, using scene safes on this, and it will save my butt and then obviously it happened. But that's one way I use it. So, but in theater is what I lean that heavily because I saw one person, a coworker who will remain nameless, he was doing a show and I knew he wasn't using automation. He was using mute groups. And, it's live music, it's live. But I was just like, you're missing more cues than you should. I know you have rehearsal and I know you're experienced. You're not a newbie. And you're missing all of these. Even though it was a complicated show, I'm like, you've had tech rehearsals. And he had long story short, I'm like, wow. Like, so I saw what I'm like, I could never. So when doing theater, it saves it. I will do it by scene. I will make an Excel spreadsheet of every single scene, and like with notes and color coded. Green is on, yellows stand by, something might happen, red's mute. So that helped, especially when I did the producers. Like that was so many mics to keep track of. And that just helped me too, of knowing like certain scenes, like. And I could give myself notes too, because especially certain boards will pop up. I know on the Pro series, I never got to use a Pro for a theater. Well, actually once, but beside the point, you can tell the Pro series when you pull up a scene, flash a note on the screen. So if it's something saying like, hey, by the way, insert actor runs around during this bit, or even like a better example, the producers, I made a note that it was on a Allen Heath T112. And it had that feature. So when that scene came up, I put it in the notes and it said, it was during the last number, which is goodbye. It told myself, be careful. Actors are in front of the hangs.
Yeah.
Don't be careful of feedback. So it's incredibly useful. And I'd love to be with an act that I work with multiple times. And like I've seen Scott Adamson did a video on how he did time code with Heim. And I was just like, I would more do that idea just to start it.
Hey guys, I'm sorry, I got a call I have to deal with, so I have to run.
Bye,
It
Steve.
was awesome seeing you. Sorry about that.
It's all good. We were winding down anyways, but catch you later.
Thanks again, Steve.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I just was using it on that, and I love the idea. And I remember during another time where the AV company, when they brought the board for the event, I was like, all right. And I inserted my thumb drive and he looked at the scenes and he's like, no one's ever used a Pro 2 like this. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, and this guy was not a newbie, from what he told me, he'd done festivals and all this. And I'm like the fact that the idea of doing that many scenes scared him. I felt like I'm practicing some dark art or something. And then later on, I watched other videos. I was like, no, you can. And he was like, well, the Pro 2 isn't a theater board. Cut to a year later, I found a video where they were using the XL8 on Jesus Christ. So I'm like, yeah, this board can be used in theater. But
are you using any macro buttons or user-defined keys or anything, Scott?
Yeah, so depending on the board, I'll start with the Pro series. That one I don't really use so much because I don't like how Midas on that one. Though on the M32, I've used user-defined keys to send MIDI signals and for mute groups and to pop up like the money channel, to pop up whatever on that. So I've used that, but the one I really get to flex it on is the CL, as mentioned in the MIDI stuff. But what I love too is one button, 9's default to the main center view, but also having it, because as flip sends on faders, pressing a button and then immediately it engages into sends on faders mode, so you can then jump around. So I use it there. I think that's at this point what I use it for, and I'm slowly starting to. Oh yeah, I also use user-defined buttons for mute groups on the CL series.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Kim and Liam? How do you use those buttons when you have them?
We already talked about this a little bit, but I mean, basically, I don't really do a lot, just like tap tempo, maybe like a reverb time, record, start, stop. And I was, speaking of the saturation thing, I had that on a user-defined saturation on off when I was using it.
I'm happy to go into mine, but it's probably going to take a minute. One of the members of Goes to 11, Tim, he and I were having a discussion earlier about double patching input channels for mixing monitors and front of house at the same console, and he said he couldn't make it tonight and asked if I would, if it came up, would I go over this? So I'm not sure.
While you're looking for that, that reminded me of something, a trick. I'm sure we've all done DJ shows or had a DJ in the show at some element. I learned a great trick. I didn't get to implement it, but we've all had the DJ show where the random MC or hype person comes up and you're like, which mic are they on? Because you can't rely too much on the meters because it's already a loud environment.
Yeah.
So what someone taught me to do is in these situations, and I figured out a workaround how to do it with the X32 M32. You gain the living daylights out of a channel, but you don't send it anywhere. So let me give a better example. So you have MC mic 1, MC mic 2, and 3. You put right next to it the identifier channel. So MC mic 1, you have the input, but let's say you probably use, I don't know, the compressor and just crank the daylight on it. So the minute the MC picks it up, it flares to red, and your eye sees that's going to red, and you know, oh, it's on 1.
Cool.
So yeah, I'm yet to do a DJ show recently after learning that, but that was just like, man, that would be really useful to do, because I know with the Yamaha you can definitely do it, and I think with what you would have to do with the M32 is, like I mentioned, you would have to, you just have to crank the living daylights out of the compressor, because doing that trick with the gain affects the original one, but just follow.
Are you guys getting any audio from me?
I'm getting.
Yeah, I'm hearing.
Yeah. Sorry, just my voice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. That means we're using my iPhone microphone, and that means that I can also use my iPhone camera.
Oh, cool.
And if I put some lights on. Right, so this is probably going to be quite difficult because I don't think, they kind of show up.
Yeah, they show up.
How well. So, so bank 1, layer 1 on the left is kick, snare top, snare bottom, snare verb send, snare verb return, toms, hat, overheads, kit verb send, kit verb return. Second layer is 3 sets of keys, guitar, 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 bass, bass. Next layer is vocals and some spares. Fourth layer is utilities channel, audience mics, some house music, bits and bobs. On the other side, I have kick and snare group, toms group, metals group. That's a kick group. Oh, sorry, they're auxes, not groups, according to Digico. Kick group, kick crush, bass, guitar, keys, BVs, a miscellaneous group for anything that doesn't fit into anything else. That's a band bus. So that's all of these, and a lead vocals group. Then on top we have control groups, and vocal effects. So it's a delay, send, and a reverb return. And at the bottom is matrices and the guitar reverb send, vocal reverb send, and the return for the delay, and the master bus. Right, now for macros, if I go to the master screen, I actually have the macro buttons window open, which is quite hard to see. Oh, there we go. So button 1 is a macro which fires, it changes layer 1 to layer 2 on both sides. So if I hit that, this is now all of the inputs, which are denoted by the angle brackets. These are the monitor mix versions of everything. So all the drums and a control group controlling drums for the monitor send. So if I'm mixing in that bus, I can control over all levels. It's the same layout as the front of house versions. So keys, guitars, bass, vocals, vocal reverb, control groups. I've stuck these keys on a separate page because these are not actually double patched. These are just mirrors of the main input. And there's some mirrors of audience mics and tracks. What it did on the other side was change from control groups and submixers and things to the subgroups that are my monitor sends. So there's mono 1 to 5 and stereo 1 to 5. Mono 1 to 6, stereo 1 to 5. And at the very bottom of there, which I've just stuck there to kind of bury, is the front of house submix, like the aux send returns. Rather than remove them from the desk, I've left them there in case I ever need to send them anywhere as stems. If I put myself back to there and then hit, so that macro changes layer 1 to layer 2 on left and right, and solos up bus 1. Pressing it again takes me back to where I was. Second macro is listen to copied audio, which just routes rather slowly playback from the MADI system.
So that's like Liam.
That's what, sorry?
Yeah, so that macro is what makes it go from the stage box to the virtual playback?
That's correct, yeah. So that was the macro that I mentioned last time, and Scott Adamson said, be very careful of that. And I laughed at him because I remember his story. What I may very well do is, if this desk comes out on tour, I might just deactivate that button and just go through it, because it's not a massive process to get to it. Is my phone gonna focus? So it's set up, cutting up. Sorry, wrong one. Audio IO, and then you just hit listen to copied audio.
Oh yeah, I would totally just do that.
Yeah, it's far safer. But to be honest, for while I'm just sat here on my own mixing multi-tracks, it's. Then earlier on we mentioned spill sets. I've got 2 here that I set up and then actually have rarely used because for whatever reason they seem to load quite slowly. So there's the band reverb, which is currently closed, and the vocal reverb. So that will, for the vocal one, for instance, will quite slowly take this side over so that it's taken me to the vocal channels and then back to wherever I was. That one, quite slowly, will load up the page with keys and guitars on. So that's the band reverb. Then I've got a button which I rarely use, which is the layer on and off button, which if I hit manually changes, manually changes that side. So that's now on the monitor sends page. And that one, number 7, if it will focus, is waves insert on and off, which if I take us to, right, can 8, 4. There we go. So insert B is on all of those. If I hit that macro 7, that turns every insert to waves off, on and off on the desk. So if at any point the wave server kicks it, I can just kind of bail. And
Yeah.
yeah. I have any other? I do. Right. So one other macro I have is, well, first of all, I've got gangs. I use gangs, but on the inputs, I've got the gangs limited to mute. So even though the kick for front of house is a separate channel, it's actually double patched with the kick for monitors. The mute are linked. So if I mute that kick there, and then go to the monitor sends, it's muted on that side as well. If I unmute there and come back, it's unmuted there. Just in case anything takes off in monitor land, while I've been thinking I've been clever and having them double patched so that I can process things differently. If I need to, I can find a channel and mute it. But then I kind of get a little bit more paranoid going down that little rabbit hole and start to think, well, what if it's on, what if I've got my vocals bank active and it's one of the drums that starts feeding back. It's only a button press, but a button press is a couple of seconds in the middle of a panicked show. So what I've done is I've added, we spoke earlier about macros that fire on and off from movement at the bottom of the fader on the control groups. Now I've done this so that if I take us to the drums bank, that's all probably illustrated best. If I pull that all the way down, that mutes everything. So that's muted.
So cool.
That's muted the sends to the 2 reverbs and all the inputs, and it's also muted all of the monitor versions. Weird thing is, if you mute one of these channels by a macro here, then the mute link done by a gang doesn't work. You actually have to include the monitor version in that macro. So if you're ever on a Digico and you're going down a rabbit hole with macros, then that's something to be aware of. But yeah, so that was drums. Then there's bass, that kills that. Guitars
That's so cool.
kill.
Yeah, because like instinctually your first thought is, even if you don't hit the mute, is like to grab the fader and slam it down, and then that actually mutes it. And I'm like, that's a really brilliant idea.
I'm not sure what I've got the BVs one. The BVs one doesn't actually do anything, and the lead vocals one mutes all vocal channels. Obviously, I'm not married to any of these inputs. Things can change. I'm quite happy for if I'm not using snare bottom, for instance, for that to turn into something else. Kind of went a bit off on one and managed to patch all my channels so that somehow I ended up with channel 16 being spare. So I've sort of moved it to here. But yeah, that's the more complex elements of my show file. I'm back. And audio back. So yeah, there's TV will turn off shortly. First time I've ever seen my telly say it was going to turn off. Yeah. That's what being in lockdown for 3.5 months does to your show file.
Man, I have my first gig with the 10-piece band that I work with coming back this weekend, and I need to get my act together and refine my file, have a look at it, and make sure I know what's going on.
Well, I've heard whisperings of potential work being booked. Nothing's confirmed yet, but I've at least had some text messages asking what my availability is like in September, which is really good news.
There you go.
Fingers crossed for that. I'm not suggesting that anyone should rush into letting people into groups again, but hopefully if things are done right and things can be done right, then we can all get back to work and stop going crazy at home.
It's so hard to say, like, especially the thing I'm doing next weekend is a wedding, and it's kind of just saying like, oh, should we really be doing weddings large enough to need a 10-piece band right now?
Yeah.
But at the same time, I also don't have any other work booked, so it's, you know, everybody's trying to make these decisions for themselves. It's hard.
Yeah. So Tim, if you are watching the replay of this, if you've got any more questions about the double patching, and I didn't really cover much there, I kind of went over macros a lot more. But if you do have any more questions, then just send me a message on Goes to 11, and we'll have a look through anything else you want to have a look at.
I think that's kind of unless Liam or Kim, I think we've kind of hit our good.
I'm good.
Yeah.
I think 2.5 hours, I think after that, unless we got more, is kind of a good.
Yeah. To be honest, I was, when there was only 3 of us to start the session off, I didn't think we'd be lasting 2.5 hours.
I don't know about you guys, but I can talk about this stuff for a long time.
Yeah.
If nobody stops me.
I know that's kind of why we wanted why we do these is like these just long talks, because like not trying to put down any of the other like ones we've been on, but it always feels like they're like, you know, at a convention, we're like, all right, it's an hour. All right, everyone gone. And it's like, and I understand why those, but I'm just like, we got nothing but time right now. Like, let's just talk. And it's like, tell stories and just keep talking, because I've already like learned things, just even though I came on half part, it's just like for next time. It's just that's how and that's kind of my goal. And Liam, I'm sure you can agree on this. Is just
it's you know, just because I mean there's a lot of people out there at the moment that are doing great work and putting out YouTube videos, and we've had the summit, and you know, there's a lot of people talking about live sound, but to be honest, I don't want people to think that if you're not the type of person that wants to go out there and set up their own YouTube channel, that it means that you don't have anything to say, because, you know, people can get together for conversations like this and, you know, share things that they might not have even considered telling other people. And you just start talking about it because it happens to be what the conversation's about. So, you know, it's nice. It's nice to hear other people's, especially, I've said this before about workflow. It's one of them things where unless you're like looking over someone's shoulder and you notice something interesting, you don't always ask, oh, how do you do this? How do you, you know, how do you bus your drums? How do you do? So yeah, it's interesting to just sit down and talk about it. But yeah, I think 2 hours 40 is probably good.
Yeah.
Especially as for me, it's 10:37. So I'm going to sit down and watch some TV now.
Sounds good.
Have a bowl of cereal. Yeah.
All right, cool.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you for coming, Kim. And
thanks guys for hosting.
Oh, you're welcome. And we plan at this point just to keep having these every week. And this, yeah. And it was interesting, not as many people showed up. It just seemed like this happened to be the day where everything was happening. Like there was a few people who showed up last week, like, sorry, couldn't come, doing this thing, and I had the OSHA thing. So it's just like, I think it's just this week. Hopefully more people will come back next week. But even so,
do we want to mention what we're planning on doing next week, or do you want to keep that surprise?
Well, since
I mean,
Kim's
it's not a big
one idea.
Surprise, but
yeah,
you know, Kim might be able to give herself some time to formulate some stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's because I figured I'm doing the OSHA class this week. Next week, it's going to be on work. It's going to be on workplace safety. Both.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, that's the main topic. We're going to come up with a secondary topic because both of us are there. But it's like, it's going to be an interesting discussion because, and I'll say it again on for next week. It's like, I'll just kind of end on this note. It's like, we're an industry that, yeah, OSHA thankfully exists, but it's like, there's so many things that every other industry has had implemented into it that ours doesn't, because of that catch-22, well, double-edged sword of, we do our jobs right if no one notices us, but then that means so many things of like, people don't know we exist, which workplace safety will also, it's not going to be, and I think we might want to do both workplace safety and mental and physical, because without kidding too much, is like we would probably also cover that, because I remember was it Joe? I forget the guy's name, who during Scott Adamson's State of the Industry one, where he had done this like mental health and physical health. We need to get his email and ask him if he wants to come, because I feel like he would be a good person to bring on that one.
Totally.
Yeah, so that's going to be a fun. There'll be some interesting stories on it, but we're also going to figure out the tech one, because that's one we want to figure out something fun for the other one. But that's going to be the headlines topic for next week.
Cool. Sounds good.
All right. Well.
All right. At this point, then, I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay.